Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's program. We have produced over 150 live streams since last March 2020. So remember to visit our website because they're all on display there for your viewing pleasure. You can also visit our website to register for programs, in addition to reviewing old programs, renew your membership, or make a donation. For those of you who aren't yet members, an individual membership is only $100 a year, and it includes exclusive benefits, which you can check out on our website. So please support us by becoming a member. For those of you who would like to ask our speaker and moderator questions today, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which will start in about 35 minutes. It's now my great pleasure to introduce today's program, The Role of Art and Artists in Middle Eastern Diplomacy, with Sultan Al Qassemi, Emirati columnist and researcher, and founder of the Barjeel Art Foundation, and Aliaa El Sandouby, senior lecturer of art and art history at LMU, and assistant professor of Islamic art and architecture at Helwan University in Cairo. It is also my pleasure to have Haza Al-Kabi, the Consul General of the UAE, join us this morning. I'd like to thank both he and his team for introducing Sultan Al Qassemi to the Council. It's now my great pleasure to bring on our speaker and our moderator for this wonderful program. Aliaa, it's so good to see you.
Thank you, Kim. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I thank the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall for inviting me to participate in this webinar with Sultan today. Sultan is, of course, the founder of the Barjeel Art Foundation, which is an independent institution established in 2010 to contribute to the intellectual development of the art scene in the Arab region through building a prominent and publicly accessible art collection in the United Arab Emirates. More than 100 artworks of this extensive Barjeel collection are now hosted on a long-term basis at the Sharjah Art Museum in the UAE. And Sultan Sooud Al Qassemi has lectured at universities across the United States and the world on the interplay between art and politics in the modern and contemporary Middle East. Most recently, he has been a visiting lecturer at the Islamic Civilization and Societies program in Boston College. And before that, Sultan was a practitioner in residence at the Hagood Kevorkian Center of Near East Studies at New York University, a Yale Greenberg World Fellow, a lecturer at the Council of Middle East Studies in Yale University, and an adjunct instructor at the Center of Contemporary Arab Studies in Georgetown University. He was also a senior lecturer at the Art History and Fine Arts Department in the American University of Paris. Sultan is also the author of Building Sharjah, a book documenting the modern architecture of the city of Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. And the book will be available by the end of June. So Mabruk, congratulations on the publication of the book. Sultan's commitment to global arts diplomacy and his passion for Middle Eastern arts are an inspiration to many people. And I count myself among the group of people that are continuously inspired by his remarkable work. So I want to welcome Sultan now, and I will be rejoining after Sultan's presentation for follow-up questions, and this will be followed up by the audience questions. So welcome, Sultan.
Thank you, Professor Aliaa. Thank you to Kim and the team from the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you to His Excellency the Consul General of the UAE in Los Angeles, who has kindly made this introduction. I will now share my screen, and please let me know that you can see this. Professor, is my screen visible to everybody?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Okay, so thank you for the kind introduction. This is going to be an overview of the relationship between politics and art in a number of countries in the Middle East and North Africa, or as we like to call it, West Asia and North Africa. Obviously, there's so much that we will not see, but I'll try to give you a little bit of a taste of 20th and even 21st century art in our very interesting region. So I'd like to begin with the idea of remaking and reintroducing identity. And in Egypt, just after the end of World War I, the Egyptians attempted to gain independence from the British, who were, for the past few decades, overseeing and ruling Egypt.
Sultan, I'm sorry to interrupt. Is it possible to move it? It looks like it didn't center. And so now we're only seeing half of your screen, and we want to make sure we can see all of it.
What about now?
Yes, that is better. Thank you so much.
Okay, hold on a second. Present. Okay. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. Technology is a blessing and a curse at times. So it's
now, is it full screen?
Perfect. That is great. Thank you so much. All right,
okay,
I'll see you in a bit.
Oh, apologies. Okay, so the British had ruled Egypt from the 19th century well into the 20th century, and when the Egyptians after World War I, or the Great War as it was known, had tried to overthrow the British presence, and there was a revolution of 1919 led by a number of important figures like Saad Zaghloul and Ahmed Urabi. Very important figures in the early 20th century of Egypt. Now, to celebrate that renaissance of Egypt, Egypt's so-called awakening, an artist was commissioned to create a monument. This monument is known as Egypt's Awakening, or in French, Renaissance d'Egypte. And it's a very important monument because it attempts to draw a line between ancient Egypt and modern Egypt. And as you can see here, the sculptor Mahmoud Mukhtar, who called himself as the first Egyptian sculptor in 2,000 years, the first Egyptian to make sculpture since the time of the pharaohs, had created this monument to celebrate the birth of a new Egypt. And what you can see here is elements taken from the Sphinx of Egypt that might be, is it still showing on half the image, by the way?
It is, yes. It's only showing half the image.
I don't know how to fix this. Well, this is actually half an image, so.
Okay, we're just seeing the name, but not seeing the full graphic.
What about now?
There you go. Moving it that way, that's making it so we can see it. There we go. There we go.
Okay, I'm so sorry about this, by the way. Okay.
That's okay. Thank you.
Going back. So if you can see here, this artwork attempted to draw a line between ancient Egypt and modern Egypt. What you see is the depiction of the Sphinx, and you see a modern woman who, in the eyes of many artists and many individuals, is representative of the nation. And you can only think as well of the Statue of Liberty, for example, amongst many other monuments that depict the nation. This woman is lifting her veil, but also attempting to place her hand on the Sphinx, thereby making a connection and perhaps almost attempting to help the Sphinx rise. And so the important point, ladies and gentlemen, here is the fact that the artist decided to choose an ancient pharaonic monument to depict modern Egypt. And the reason why, ladies and gentlemen, this was done is because the Egyptians wanted a neutral icon that all Egyptians could associate with, whether it was Egyptian Christians, Muslims, or Jews, or any of the other ethnic groups in Egypt, that they could all draw inspiration from their common ancestry, which is the pharaonic, Egypt. This is something, by the way, that we saw here referred to as Neo-Pharaohism, We saw this happen in other parts of the Middle East and North Africa, including Iraq, where you had Neo-Babylonian, Neo-Sumerian, and other movements of the type. So this was a way also to give Egyptians a new sense of identity. Everybody would refer to this work. It was placed in front of the train station, one of the most important squares in Cairo. Anybody who enters Cairo, exits Cairo, sees this work. It became a landmark. It became a way to identify with each other. Friends, this is an icon that went onto Egyptian posters, into Pepsi and cola soda cans, into postage stamps, and even the currency. So if you pick up an Egyptian currency note today, you will see that monument. So it was and continues to be a very important monument. And much like the Statue of Liberty in the US, Egyptians paid money. They fundraised in order to complete this monument. So it's a very important moment, a turning point in Egypt in the early 20th century. I'm going to move on to this work, which I hope is visible to everybody. Okay, so this work here this work actually caused its author, its painter, to be thrown in jail. So as I speak, I'll let you hazard a guess on why the author and the painter of this work was thrown in jail in Egypt. Not only was he thrown in jail, his mentor, his teacher, was thrown in jail with him. The person who recommended this artist present a work that so offended the monarchy and the royal court in Egypt. So there was an exhibition sometime in 1949. Egypt was still a monarchy then. And this young artist called El Ghazar entered into the competition with this work, but it was seen as an affront to the monarchy. And some people might have guessed, oh, it might be the naked woman in the work. That's a good guess, perhaps, but not in this case. In this case, it is the empty plates in front of all these women, the empty plates that reflect the poverty and the destitution that the Egyptians were experiencing under the monarchy. And it was only 3 years after this work was painted that the monarchy was overthrown. And lucky for us, apparently a janitor or somebody working in that exhibition hall or space had saved this painting from being destroyed. And that's why we have images of this work. And so here you see the subversive nature of artists in Egypt. In the previous slide, you saw an artist who was commissioned by the state to create a public monument. In this slide, you see an artist who was subversive, an anti-monarchy, and who was thrown in jail. Another country that I like to talk about a lot is Iraq. I'm going to try and move this because I feel like the whole screen isn't showing or the image is not showing. And this is my fault because I'm such a rookie when it comes to this technology. So here I'd like to show you this work by Iraqi artist Mahmoud Mukhtar. Now Mahmoud Mukhtar was Jawad Salim and Shakir Hassan Saeed. So these two individuals, ladies and gentlemen, founded the Baghdad Modern Art Group. They get up in 1951 and they read from a manifesto. And they say, we would like to present a new movement in Iraqi art. We would like to call upon Iraqis to look deep into their culture, into their own heritage, and create art that is inspired by our own heritage and not only by global art. They do reference Picasso, but they say Picasso was inspired by African art. And so we should be inspired by global art as well as local heritage. A couple of examples I can give you is if you look at the artworks here, the faces and even the body parts look like they're taking inspiration from the crescent. And the crescent plays an important role in Iraqi popular culture. You also see, and I'm not sure you can see this, I'm going to try to move the screen. There is a depiction of a watermelon. And I'm so sorry about this. I'm going to try and zoom out, but I can't do that. Okay, I'm going to move on now to this work. So is this a full screen? Do you see a full screen here, or do you see part of it?
You can move it a little bit to the right. so we can see more.
But you don't see a full screen here.
No, that's cutting it off.
Okay, let me try to minimize the size of my screen here. I'm so sorry, everybody. It's the first time I ever present on web on this web
webinar.
go
It's
to
all
webinar.
good.
Yes. Okay. Well, we'll try to talk about the work as much as possible. So, what if I do this? What happens? Okay. Very well. So this work by you can only see half of it, right?
Correct.
I wouldn't know how to expand this. Okay, let's see. So you see more of it here.
Yes.
Okay, so this work by Iraqi artist Kazem Haidar is a work that was created in the aftermath of an uprising in Iraq in 1958. And this uprising, where you can see most of the screen here, was against the monarchy. And a lot of civilians were shot and killed. And this is just a couple of images from the protest. And they were demanding rights, and the monarchy then had ordered the police to open fire at the protesters. And what happened was this artist invited one of the protesters to tell him what had happened. And you can see here the protester here has told the artist, "I will tell you what happened. I was there. I attended this very violent dispersion of the protesters. I saw police shoot at innocent civilians," and this is the depiction of that. "I saw tanks roll into the street. I saw people pleading for their lives. I saw planes fly at low altitude, and I even saw a rape in front of my eyes." And so, as you can see here, this is a way that at a time where cameras were not allowed to record history, ladies and gentlemen, friends, this is how an artist's paintbrush was used to depict and to capture important moments in history. Okay. I also like to talk about the important Jewish community in Egypt. Egypt had a thriving Jewish community that here is captured in the paintbrush of Amy Nimmer. Egypt had over 100,000 Jews, I think, just in Cairo. Many of them very successful members of society. And one of them is Ezekiel Baruch. Ezekiel Baruch was a figurative artist who also did abstract art, but I'm not talking about him here as an abstract or figurative artist. I'm in fact talking about Ezekiel Baruch as an artist who, oh, this is also a stunning piece that he has done, apparently of his girlfriend, but no one really knows who this person is. So this is called Mademoiselle AC. But I talk about Ezekiel Baruch as an activist for human rights. So artists here, including Ezekiel Baruch, joined forces, ladies and gentlemen, with other intellectuals, with scholars, with lawyers, with teachers, artists, and other public intellectuals, and formed a society called the Arts and Liberty Group, Art et Liberté in French. And this society issued a manifesto. They were so horrified by the treatment of Jews and non-Jews alike by the fascists and the Nazis of Europe, that they issued this public proclamation called Vive l'art dégénère, which is long live degenerate art, so-called degenerate art, which is the phrase that the Nazis used against many artists, Jew and not Jew alike. And so you have here a very important example of Middle Easterners standing up for the rights of Europeans. And I like to remind people of this, that in the 1930s, many Middle Easterners, including Christians, Jews, and Muslims, did stand up for universal human values, for universal rights, especially to those living in Europe under the yoke of some of the most fascist regimes in the 20th century. So it's an important document that I encourage you to read more about. Now, this is one of my favorite parts of this presentation, and I hope the screen shows you most of these works. So Gamal Abdel Nasser, for those who don't know, ruled Egypt from 1954 to 1970. So over these 16 years, he was the single most important and powerful leader in the region, in the Arab world at least, and one of the most important leaders of the 20th century, a co-founder of the non-aligned movement in the 1950s, a huge force in the so-called Third World. And he inspired a movement called Pan-Arabism. What is Pan-Arabism? Pan-Arabism is a movement of attempt to unite all the Arab states into one mega state. That was the idea of Pan-Arabism. The idea was that it was the colonial forces that had divided all these Arab countries, and now we want to unite into one mega state. And here you see a Kuwaiti artist in the 1950s depicting Abdel Nasser with the flag of the United Arab Republic, which is the merger of Egypt and Syria into one state, which took place in 1958 and lasted for 3 years. And as you see here, there is this rainbow kind of shape of a flag that extends from one end of the Arab world to the other end, to the Gulf. And Abdel Nasser is looming above this massive geographic area. I'm not particularly fond of this artwork, but the others are much nicer. Here you see Abdel Nasser, once again larger than life, being depicted with a throng of individuals behind him. Why is Abdel Nasser surrounded by people? Because he has just nationalized the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal, very important waterway that connects Europe to Asia and Africa. And for several decades, the French and the British controlled it and took most of the revenues. And in 1956, he nationalized the canal, thereby triggering a war on Egypt by France, Israel, and Britain. And the Americans actually intervened and stopped this war. So it was a case of the Americans intervening here that ended the war. 1957, this artist creates this work. And this artist, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, was a huge fan of Gamal Abdel Nasser. He revered him. He was a friend of his. I think they were born in the same year. And as you can see here, Egyptians from all walks of life have come together, women with veils, army officers, a religious scholar with a turban on his head on the right, and sort of people in suits, people who look like so-called peasants, workers. Everybody is surrounding Nasser and looking at him in awe, unable to shut their eyes, attempting to come closer, ever so closer to Gamal Abdel Nasser. And of course, here he looks handsome and dashing, as he always has in all these photos that were clearly managed, because no one can look good in all camera photos. You can ask me about that. So moving forward, what was depicted during the Nasser era? Well, the role of laborers. Remember, Abdel Nasser was a socialist, so laborers were depicted in many artworks in the time of Abdel Nasser. This by Hamid Awais, same artist from the previous work, and this by Fatima Arargi, a break the workers are taking. Fatima, very important Egyptian modernist, still alive. She's in her 90s. And Gazbiya Sirri here depicting the brutal crackdown of the monarchy against the Egyptian students and labor force. And so now that these artists have freedom under Abdel Nasser, well, everything is relative, but they had more freedom to depict police brutality, and that's what they did in the 1950s. Another theme in Abdel Nasser's Egypt was the union of Syria and Egypt. Remember, we talked about it, Egypt and Syria united for 3 years. This is an image depicting two young kids sort of almost going to the bosom of Arab nationalism, hugging Arab nationalism, and the other Arab states here depicted in these men and women in the back are standing in awe, almost awaiting their turn. You can imagine Iraq, you can imagine Sudan, all of them wanting to be part of this mega state, at least in the eyes or in the imagination of the artist. Now, Gamal Abdel Nasser, one of my favorite paintings, here being depicted as giving a speech in 1960 at the United Nations General Assembly, and who's who of world power is sitting in the front row, waiting his speech and attempting to grasp every moment and every word of Abdel Nasser. You see some of his adversaries, including leaders of the United States and the United Kingdom. But you also see some allies, like the leader of the USSR, and some really good friends, like the leaders of India, Ghana, Yugoslavia, and Indonesia. And look behind him, you see Fidel Castro on the left, and on the right, you see behind him, notice, on the right, you see the the Saudi king sitting in the back. I'm not sure you can see this or not, but it clearly shows you the power play and the power dynamic within the Arab world. Artists here are attempting to depict their leader, the leader of Egypt, as being the primary leader. And one last thing, friends, notice the empty seat in the front. Whose seat is that? It's Abdel Nasser's seat, because when he's done speaking, he's going to go and take over and sit front and center, because that's where, in the eyes of the artist, Abdel Nasser belongs. Now, Abdel Nasser wasn't an angel. He, in fact, jailed this important activist called Inji Aflatun. This is one of the rare works that survived her time in jail. In the 1950s and 60s. Many of the works were destroyed, and a very few number of works exist to this day. I will move on because we have so much to talk about. This is actually, if I showed you the beginning of Abdel Nasser and the celebration of Abdel Nasser, this is the end of Abdel Nasser's era. This is a painting by Hamid Owais in which he depicts a peasant or a farmer or a regular person holding a machine gun, and he is providing protection to Egypt. And why is this important? It's because the Egyptian army had just lost the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War is the war in which Israel had conquered Sinai, huge territory of Egypt, and the Egyptians had experienced a moral blow. Not only was their army defeated, but also a huge part of their country now occupied. And so this artist attempted to give the Egyptians a boost to their morale and show them that, don't worry, we are able to protect ourselves because every one of us is the protector of life. And as you can see at the bottom of the painting, images of weddings and ceremonies and schools and children playing. And the idea here is life goes on even if we had lost this war. Now, Palestine is an important part of what unifies many artworks and artists in the region. I'm going to skim through these because there's a few other works I want to show you. Here you see a painting called Where To, which is by a Palestinian artist from the early 50s. Of course, 700,000 Palestinians were displaced in 1948 when Israel was created. And as you can see here, this refugee is at a loss of not knowing where to go. And even where he's come from is unclear. And you see other depictions of this what they call the death march of so many people having lost their homes and having been made refugees almost overnight. But I want to show you that not only Palestinians were depicting this, Syrians were depicting the Palestinian freedom fighters. It's a very important part of Arab history, as well as this monumental piece that borrows elements and ideas from Picasso's Guernica. You see the mangled bodies. Now, this was a massacre depicted, a massacre that had taken place against the Palestinians by the Lebanese South Lebanon Army, the SLA, who had massacred 2,000 to 3,000 Palestinians at the Sabra and Shatila refugee camp. You see the mangled bodies, the very limited use of color other than black and white, some blues and some reds, but not much else. From the UAE, you have an Emirati artist here depicting the first Intifada. And so artists from the Levant, from Egypt, from North Africa, all in solidarity with the Palestinian cause from the 1940s onwards. Now, non-Arab causes I'd like to talk about. This is many Arab artists stood, and many Middle Eastern artists stood in solidarity with non-Arab causes. Here you see the depiction of the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, I'm not sure if you know who he was. He was the first democratically elected leader of the Congo, the DR Congo. And the artist here depicting him in a very similar fashion to how African sculptures are created. Moving on, you see a depiction of Angela Davis by an artist from Egypt called Inji Aflatun. She's the same one who was thrown in jail, if you remember, Inji Aflatun. So again, the civil rights movement played an important role. Just like this work here, you see an artist depicting a Black American or African American woman in the 1960s. Again, the peak of the civil rights movement. This work is one of my favorites. It's an Iranian artist, and it's about the assassination of Martin Luther King. Bahman Muhassis made this in 1968 in his signature style of creating human reflections of human bodies, almost in an abstract nature. I just leave it up for a couple of seconds because it's a marvelous piece, one of my favorite works. Another important theme that Middle Eastern artists covered was the Holocaust. And now you have to keep in mind that unlike today, where information is readily available, it took decades for the full extent of the Holocaust to be made apparent. And even today, we are still learning about the horrors of what happened in the 1930s and 40s. And so it's quite impressive that this Iranian artist in the 1950s depicts this monumental piece of 6 by 10 feet, huge artwork on the horrors, capturing the horrors and the inhumane treatment of Jews and also non-Jews by the Nazis. Again, a very, very important painting. I always like to show it to the students because the Middle East was not living in a bubble like people thought. In fact, we were part of the worldwide movement for human rights all the way from the early 20th century. One of my favorite works is this one. I'm not sure if any of you is familiar with Johnson & Johnson, not their coronavirus vaccine, but before the COVID-19 vaccine, they used to make shampoos. I'm not sure if they still do it. And on the shampoos, they had stickers, no more tears stickers. The idea of the no more tears stickers is a parent or a guardian would buy it for their child so that if the shampoo or the soap goes into their eyes, it wouldn't cause them to cry or be sad or be upset or be in pain. And so Abdel Nasser Gharam, a Saudi artist, in fact, was a government administrator who used to make these works from stamp lacquer. Why stamp lacquer? Because he was an administrator who used to stamp a lot of documents, and so he was inspired by reusing the stamp lacquer to make maps and images. And so here he's created a map of the Arab world in 2009, and he's placed the stickers, the no more tears stickers, on all of the sad parts of the Arab world. Iraq, obviously, was in the midst of a civil war, South Sudan, Somalia, and of course, Israel, Palestine, huge red color with the no more tears, like depicting how sad that part of the world is. Now, this is 2009. I'm sure you've heard of the Arab Spring. It was a major movement that took place in the 2011 and 12. So the artist revisits this work 5 years later, after the Arab Spring. He comes back to it in 2019. And I'm sure you can guess the amount of tears. I don't think it went down, probably went up. So I'm going to show you now. Remember what this map looks like, because the next map is the 2014 version. Are you ready for it? We're going to the next image now. Here it is. Look at the amount of tears that the region is experiencing. You have, not only are there more tears, there are bigger tears. They're just massive, giant tears. And there are new countries. They're the same countries that we had, Israel, Palestine, and Iraq and South Sudan, which by then had become an independent state. But there are new countries that were not included in the previous map in terms of stickers. Libya, Tunisia, Yemen, Bahrain, Syria, and Egypt. So you see the majority of the Arab world is now experiencing more tears. And so the artists try to make the no more tears stickers bigger and bigger. The last work I will show you is this, one of my favorite works by an artist called Mona Hatoum. This work is called Infinity, and it is inspired by something that many of you might have had as boys and girls alike. Little green army men. Are you familiar with these? I used to have them when I was a kid, and I remember the characteristics of these toys are basically that you buy them in bulk. You go to Kmart or Walmart, or when I was in France or Europe, we'd go to Auchan or Carrefour, which are the big supermarkets in France and Europe, and you'd buy them in bulk. They come in a bag, and I think they were 20 or 30, and they were a few dollars. They weren't so expensive. And Mona Hatoum, uses these little green men or little army men to create this work in bronze. So as you see here, this is a table that has an infinity sign made by these little army men. This work was created between 91 and 2001. So 91 is the Gulf War, and 2001 is September 11th. And so what she's looking at is the endless cycle of wars in the region. And she's also depicted the little green men or the green army men as a way to show that these individuals are not distinguished from each other, that wars renders them, it abstracts them, it makes them all the same. We don't distinguish between one soldier and another. We forget that they're human beings. And also the fact that they are little green men or green army men shows how disposable they are. If you lose a soldier in war, you get another one. You just get another soldier. It's not the end of the world. You're not really sad that you've lost a soldier. And she's also depicted it in this bronze sculpture to reflect the monumentality and also the rigid nature of these works. These are bronze, they're rigid, they're almost frozen. War is a frozen state of being in the region. There's always going to be a war, and it's infinity, it's endless. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, I draw your attention to what this sculpture or monument is made on. It is made not on a military table, not on the table that one of the generals would be using to plan a war, but it is created on a coffee table, one that you find at your home. Each of you might have a coffee table that you pull out if a guest comes over, right? Why does she do that? Because she wants to reflect the domestic nature of war. War affects the household. War affects everybody's home. It comes back to where you live. And so it's not only a vicious cycle, but it's a cycle that affects every one of us where we live. I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Professor, I can't hear you. You might be muted. Professor Ali, I can't hear you. Is it a problem from me? I can hear you now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Sorry about that. So thank you so much for that inspiring and excellent talk. I really appreciate the work that you have done. That was really fascinating. And I want to start off by saying you have so well illustrated examples of Arab and Middle Eastern art and artist engagement in the regions and the world's really political and historical events, and really gave us a sense of the diversity and the wide range of issues that are addressed in the region's artistic production in the modern and contemporary periods. The examples you shared with us today certainly are a reminder that the region has been and is home to many different diverse communities, and it is a complex and a hybrid region where artists often cross boundaries, ethnic, linguistic, or class boundaries to really articulate important issues. And in the same time, they maintain that dialogue with international and European art movements and styles, and they had these constant conversations with the world around them. The works you showed us also really challenge the understanding that modern art is largely a Euro-American phenomena. So I guess my first question relates to the idea of decolonization and how we can, as you mentioned before, deoccupy and free our minds, right, of certain ideas that are dictated by Eurocentric views. So can you please talk about what it has been like trying to incorporate artists from this region into the modernist canon? And do you think that history now is being written differently as we try to reimagine and maybe rethink what defines modern art today?
Thank you, Professor Ali. That's a great question, actually, and I have a very positive answer for you because I think things are changing in our lifetime. It's one of those things in life where I see a daily change, and I want to say that we have a lot of allies in the West. We have a lot of allies in the East. We have a lot of allies in our own region who are interested in a global dimension of art. In the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, as you said, the history of modern art was written in a very Eurocentric and Western style. But today, you have books written about artists from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, the Middle East, and even Eastern Europe was neglected to a large degree. And I think the world is a richer place. I don't see it from a negative. I see that we're adding value to value. We're adding wealth to wealth. Nobody's taking away from Western art. In fact, we're adding beauty to beauty. And I think that this is something that we should all celebrate. We should all celebrate the discovery of modernism and modern histories across the world. The not discovery, but the exposure to art from India, the exposure to art from Egypt, the exposure to art from Mexico. Look how the Americans are so much more advantaged knowing so much about Mexican art than they would have been had they not been exposed to Mexican art and the Mexican muralist Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo. Americans are really interested in that art. And so my mission and so many others is to expose not only Americans, but the world and even ourselves, Professor Aliaa, even each other in the Arab world, expose each other to the modern history in our region. Before I started taking art to the West, I started taking art to my region. I started taking art to Egypt and Jordan and Iran and Kuwait and other countries in the Middle East and North Africa. So this dialogue is ongoing. Unfortunately, it's a long road ahead. I teach a class on modern Middle Eastern art history, and I tell my students, some of whom are 19 and 20-year-old Americans, I tell them, you are the first person ever to write about this artist, and that this artist, this woman, was forgotten in history. And I ask their permission to publish their articles, only because it becomes a reference guide. In some cases, Professor, my students in Sciences Po and the French University created a Wikipedia page of an Egyptian woman who had nothing about her, a couple of lines on the internet. And so they had a coursework for another class. Just the fact that they created a Wikipedia page for her was such a big step for us, at least. Every step counts. And as I said, we're not taking away from any other culture, we're adding value to each other's histories.
Thank you. Yeah, this is really fascinating and it's inspiring, and it's really important to talk about this, both here in the West, but also in the region within the Arab world. And I wanted also to ask you about female artists. So you mentioned your students writing about a woman artist. There is such a long and strong history of female modernist and contemporary artists in the region, from Egypt, of course, but also Iraq and Iran and Lebanon. Could you talk about the significant role of female artists from the region and how they're represented and included in the Barjeel art collection, perhaps more now than before?
Oh, I love that question, Professor. I love your questions. Okay, so let's begin by the role of women artists in the Middle East in the 20th century. From the very early 20th century, not only in the Middle East, but across the world, women were disadvantaged. Men took away women's rights, and they continue to do that in many parts of the world, by the way. But in the early 20th century, not only in the Middle East, but across the world, art schools were established that denied women opportunities to study. And so when the first art school was opened in Egypt in 1908, it only accepted men. It took a generation. By 1937 or 38 was the first time that women were allowed to study art professionally. But that is not to say that there were no women artists, but they came from the elite because their parents brought them tutors. They had private tutors. They didn't go to an academy. And so going back to the early 20th century, yes, there were women artists in Egypt who were not only painters, but they were sculptors. They were craftswomen. They were people who they were fashion designers and just regular designers in Egypt. The same thing I could say for artists in Iran, in Iraq, in Turkey, in Morocco. They were all disadvantaged, but they managed to create a niche for themselves. When you think of an artist like Jawad Salim, him and his sister created art at the same time. Jawad sells for $1.5 million an artwork, whereas his sister sells for $8,000. Now, it doesn't make sense to me that they both came from the same background. They were both founders of the same movement. They were both highly respected intellectuals. They were both scholars. They both taught in school. I don't think he was 1,000 times better. I'm not sure about my maths, but I don't think he was 1,000 times better than his sister. And so it shows you that there is definitely an element of sexism. There's definitely an element of gender bias that men what's the word? That men displayed against women. At Barjir, with the collection that I founded about 15 years ago, we took a decision a year and a half ago to only show gender balanced exhibitions. So I took a challenge and I said, would I be able to have an exhibition of 120 works that is gender balanced 50-50, 50% exactly men and 50% women? It was a challenge, and many people told me, don't do it. It's unfair to women. So even women scholars, professor, were against it. And I'll tell you why. They had a point, although I disagreed, but they had a point, which I will explain to you. And their point was that it's unfair to show an exhibition of 100 works by men and women, where only a few women had a chance to go on scholarship, and 90% of the scholarships were given to men. How can you show an equal quality of work? But I said, let's try. And what I did is we bulldozed through, we did it, and we created an exhibition. And I brought a lot of the individuals who were critical of the idea. And I said, tell me the truth. Do you see a marked difference? Do you see a huge decrease in the quality of the work? And they said no. And I'll tell you why. Because women were creating different forms of art. They were doing works on tapestry. They were doing works using henna. They were doing works on leather. They were doing works on burlap. They were using new material that men were not trained to use, because men were trained by Western scholars and Western artists who trained them how to do works on canvas and sculpture. This is what art was, canvas and sculpture, which is fine, but it's not the only kind of art. And so women were much more creative. And the last person I will talk about is the Tunisian modernist Safiya Farhat, who was the first woman and the first Tunisian to head the fine art school. She walks into the fine art school in the 1950s, Professor Aliaa. She tears up the manual and she goes, you've been taught that art is only on canvas and sculpture. Today, we're introducing tapestry, we're introducing ceramics, we're introducing all forms of art that were not allowed and not permitted. And so the quality of art actually increased when women were allowed and when women were given the helm.
Right, and you showed us some wonderful examples today of the works of Inji Aflatun and Ghazabeh al-Sirri, but also Amy Nimr, right? Not so many people know about this very important woman artist who was probably the first to travel abroad, right? And to study in London in the early 20th century. So thank you for that. So I want to hope we have time for more questions. I want to ask you also about art as a witness to dispossession and war. And specifically, you showed us the work by Mona Hatoum, of course, her work on war, but also on the pain of exile and separation from the homeland. And I wanted to ask you about the importance of including these kinds of artworks today. It's important to bring the voices of displaced people or people who create art from a distance. They're also part of the story, right? So can you talk about this a little bit, especially with the latest events, and talk about how art humanizes us to each other?
You know, the adage that a picture's worth 1,000 words, it's kind of true in a way where instead of you reading an article that would take you 8 or 9 minutes, which you should read articles, they're very important, you can look at a photograph or a painting, and then you immediately feel a greater sense of understanding. Think of the image of Aylan Kurdi, the little child who was washed up on the Mediterranean, and how that image affected all of us, whether we came from the Middle East or not. We were all devastated. And so many images of many different events in the 20th century, including the Holocaust, for example, where you would not have been able to imagine not only the scale, but the viciousness of the event had it not been for photographs. And so documentation is very important. And the same thing happened with Vietnam, Professor Aliaa. You can imagine the important images that came out of Vietnam, and these there's a direct correlation between the American withdrawal and the disapproval by Americans because of the images of the war. And so Mona Hatoum herself was a refugee. She's the one who did the Infinity War. She was a refugee. Her parents left Palestine when Israel was created, and she went to Lebanon, and then she was displaced when the Lebanese Civil War happened in 1975. She was in England for a short break, and then she couldn't go back for decades a decade and a half back to Lebanon. And so displacement plays an important role. And I think over the past 2 weeks, we saw, unfortunately, the Israeli onslaught on Gaza and the war that happened there. The role of artists was very important in not just photographing the events, but also depicting a lot of in paintings and especially in digital art, depicting the suffering of many individuals. You saw President Biden call for an end of the onslaught only because, or largely because, of the images that we were seeing. This is not the same case in parts of the world where the media and journalists are banned from covering events.
Absolutely. So I have a lot more questions about the artworks, but I want to make sure that we have enough time for audience questions. So one more questions, or should we go to the audience?
We should probably go to audience questions since we're going to wrap up at the end of the hour. I'm so sorry, but thank you so much. Our first question comes from the Consul General. Sultan, what kind of art do you expect to come out from the pandemic?
Wow, what an interesting question. And I can tell you, I started buying works by artists who have created work during the pandemic. We see a lot of works that reflect isolation, whether it's paintings or abstract art. There's an artist I follow called Slimane Mansour from Palestine, and he does a lot of these beautiful works of people coming together, celebrations, and he started making works of a single individual sitting in the living room on the corner on his own. So unfortunately, a lot of us remember the time in which we were told to stay home. In many cases, it was against the law to go out, but also we see a lot of works of compassion, a lot of works where families are depicted being together. We see images of love, we see images of families, and so again, I like to look always at the positive side, and I think there's going to be a lot of beauty come out, just like we've seen with music and poetry. I expect movies to be made about the pandemic. Unfortunately, we'll be reminded about it for the rest of our lives.
Thank you. This next questioner says, thank you for sharing the works of extraordinary Middle Eastern artists who have responded to the geopolitical events in the area. Are there also any Western artists who have created works responding to these Middle Eastern events as well?
Plenty of Western artists came and created work. I think the one I could tell you most about is Banksy. Banksy is a huge ally of us in the Middle East. We love him or her. I actually don't know if it's a man or a woman. And he's humanized the region. He's gone and he created graffiti. He's given works away for charity. And so we're grateful to them, using a neutral term because I don't know his or her gender, and there's a history of many artists going back to the 1960s and 70s. If you think of the Mexican muralists, Siqueiros came to the Middle East in the 1950s and wrote the introduction text to N.G. Platón's exhibition in 1958 that I have my students read and analyze. And so from the mid 20th century until today, a lot of artists came not only from the West, but also from Latin America, from Africa, and elsewhere. And many artists from the region went and lived with American artists. I'll just say one example. We had an artist called Ibrahim As-Salahi. If you remember, he is the one who depicted the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the funeral and the crescent with the African sculpture style of figures. He lived in New York in the 1950s and 60s with the African American Spiral Group. And so he learned a lot from the Spiral Group. He taught them a lot. He learned a lot and he took it back with them. And one thing he learned from them is spray can, the use of spray can, which African American artists were using from the 60s. We didn't have that in the Middle East. And so he brought it with them. He brought it with him back into Sudan, and he created a giant work that's now in the collection of the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi.
Thank you. Can you comment on where notable art by Middle Eastern artists is held? How much is available to publics in the Middle East itself, as opposed to private collections and collections outside the Middle East? And what are the trends?
Okay, so the largest collections of art locally are the state collections. You think of states like Egypt that has over 12,000 works, Tunisia, 17,000 works, very impressive. Lebanon, 2,000 works in the state collection. And so you have state collections, I think, across the region, but the biggest private collector passed away a month ago. Ramzi Dalloul, a Palestinian Lebanese or Lebanese Palestinian, died at the age of 86. Columbia University PhD graduate, amassed a collection of 3,000 to 4,000 works. He passed away and his collection is now in Lebanon. Unfortunately, many of these works are not available for the public. So in Lebanon, there is no national museum. In Egypt, the National Art Museum was closed for a large part since the revolution of 2011. They've reopened recently, but I don't know how long for. Tunis, with their 17,000 works, no art museum. In the UAE, we have the Louvre, but we don't have a national museum for Emirati artists. My collection, or the collection I started, is in the Sharjah Art Museum, and we try to show art from across the region, including Jewish, Muslim, Christian artists, Baha'i artists, and many different faiths and ethnicities. So what we have done, to the questioner, what we have done is try to put the art online. And I also have a touring exhibition that is now at Boston College Art Museum, the Macmillan. 88 paintings are on display there. So my collection, part of it is touring the East Coast of the US.
Thank you. What countries or subregions of the Middle East do you see as neglected or as blind spots for Western language art historians of the 20th century? And which do you see as now rising?
Can I say that I don't think this question should be about Western art historians. Myself, I'm an Arab art historian, and I've neglected parts of my region. I have neglected parts like Yemen, like Oman, like Libya, like Mauritania, these countries that I don't know much about, and I'm still trying to learn. And I in fact, a lot of people, when they show me an artwork by an artist from Yemen or elsewhere, I tell them I don't know this artist. And they say, how could you be a person who doesn't know about this artist? I say, actually, it makes me happy that there's so much more for me to learn. It's an opportunity for me to expand my knowledge. And so it's not just Western artists, Jessica, it's us. I'm sure Professor Aliaa agrees with me that we need to take a deeper look into our own region, but also surrounding regions. So Africa, Asia, part of the Mediterranean, these are complementary regions, and these are regions that are very close to us in the Middle East.
Thank you. One final question. What is the state of street art in the Middle East?
Oh, I have an entire presentation on street art that I just stopped. Street art is alive and kicking. It's alive in Lebanon. It's alive in Sudan and Algeria and Egypt and Iraq. In fact, since the Arab Spring, street art has gone up, even in appreciation. A lot of people say, but Sultan, a lot of these street artworks were painted over. They disappeared. And I tell them, yes, this is the nature of graffiti. It's ephemeral. It's supposed to be there for a short period of time. Very few walls survive for decades. And the biggest example is the Berlin Wall, right? That's the wall that survived for the past 50, 60 years. It became an artwork. But in general, street artists, what you do is you create the artwork, you take a photograph of it. Sometimes it lasts for a few weeks or months, and then it's painted over. Someone else comes and creates an artwork. As long as it's documented and photographed, I'm fine with that. And so street artists today are commanding tens of thousands of dollars of their art. They don't like to be called street artists. They're artists who operate on the street, but they're just artists. And there's a book called Murals of the Revolution in Egypt. It's a fantastic book. And another Egyptian artist called Bahia Shihab just released a book about her art. I'm sure Aliaa knows her as well. There's a lot of street art across the region, which I really like. Digital art also now is very, very popular.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. I know with this pandemic, it's been so hard to be able to, not be able to access museums and galleries. So hopefully this scratched an itch for some of us, although things should be opening up soon. And Consul General, thank you so much for making this introduction. It was a wonderful event. I'll turn it back over to you, Professor El Sandouby.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And thank you so much, Sultan, for your patience and for answering all of those questions. And thanks to the audience for the thoughtful questions and for being part of this conversation. This has been fascinating. Okay, over to you.
Hi, thank you both for such an educational and important discussion. I love the part about No More Tears. That was such a wonderful story, and I loved your enthusiasm. Hopefully, we'll work with Jessica, and maybe we can make some of your artwork available either on our website or in an email to the viewers so they could see the whole portfolio. I'm sure it's just brilliant. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.